This is our second attempt at a video lecture to aid us in catching up with respect to snow days. It covers material that I feel is very descriptive but nonetheless important in our understanding when we get to the immune system. So I encourage everyone to have a fairly good understanding of this when we begin talking about the body's defenses. To begin with, we're just going to go through the structure of the lymphatic system. It's made up of structures that we think of as lymph, and lymph now is nothing more than a fluid, very similar, we're going to see, to blood, that similarly also travels through vessels. Instead of blood vessels now, we think of things such as lymph vessels. Some cells that are involved are lymphocytes. We talked about these somewhat when we talked about blood, but we'll also be coming back to these again when we're talking about the immune system. Lymph nodules, lymph nodes, tonsils, the spleen, and red bone marrow, along with the thymus gland, are also important when we're talking about this system. We're going to talk in more detail about each of these in somewhat detail, but if we just take a peek at our diagram to the right, these tubes here that we see that are very close to the surface of the skin are our lymph vessels. We then are going to see areas where we also have lymph nodes. We have the tonsils, which we know are associated here with the mouth and in the area of the throat. We'll see the spleen, which is up here, if you recall, from the upper right-hand quadrant. The thymus gland, which lies just above the heart, which is in that area that we call the mediastinum. And then we know that bone marrow is found within spongy bone in the various bones where we find, in fact, spongy bone. The functions of this lymph system is, one, to maintain fluid balance in the tissues. We did talk again about this briefly when we talked about the fluid exchange between blood and tissues. And if you recall, it was the lymph system and the lymph capillaries that picked up the excess fluid that was remaining back in the tissues. We also are going to see in more detail when we talk about the digestive system that this is the area where fats are absorbed from the foods that we eat and ultimately make their way into the circulatory system for distribution. And lastly, the area that we're going to talk an entire chapter on when we talk about the body's defenses is that it defends us against microorganisms and foreign substances. This fluid that we call lymph is that remaining 50% of the fluid that has entered the tissue space as a result of capillary exchange. We talked about that. This fluid has to be picked up by the lymph in order for there to be a balance with respect to all of the tissue fluid that remains back in the tissues. Approximately 2 liters of lymph are produced per day, and it's made up of primarily water, dissolved solutes, small amounts of protein, and potentially foreign substances. Now, the reason we see small amounts of protein, if you recall, is that this fluid is in fact first derived from the blood. That this lymph fluid, as the fluid is pushed through the walls of the capillaries from the tissue space. I emphasize on numerous occasions that proteins are very large. Once again, as a consequence, here we see a large ones cannot get through the walls of the capillary flowing through and get into that tissue network. So in many aspects, lymph is very, very similar to now much of blood plasma is picked up with a major difference having much less protein and is returned into the blood circulation. But we've commented now that about 15% of it remains here, and to prevent it from being built up, it then has to pass into these lymph vessels, and as we're going to see shortly, ultimately gets returned back to the blood. Now, the beginnings of this flow takes place at a structure that we call a lymph capillary. Lymph capillaries are very similar to blood capillaries, but there are some very distinct differences. A first major difference is that these are closed-end vessels. When we think of blood capillaries, they're continuous, arterial end to venous end, but here we see that they end in a closed sac. Another major difference is that these lymph capillaries lack a basement membrane, making them thinner and even more permeable than blood capillaries. A second aspect that makes them even more permeable yet is that the cells that make up the walls of these capillaries overlap, much like the shingles on a roof. So what you can envision from looking at the pointer, if pressure were to press here, it would open that flap and allow fluid then to enter in. This is going to be very, very important because if you recall when we talked about veins, they had the presence of what we call semilunar valves. And as muscle squeezed on those semilunar valves, it increased the pressure, pushing blood forward. But then when they relaxed, it more or less sucked blood into the segment that was just had the blood squeezed out of it. A similar type of action occurs with lymph, so that if you could envision up here being a larger lymph vessel, there's valves in there. When muscle squeezes on it, it pushes that lymph forward, but then it sucks lymph up from below. At sucking lymph up from below, it then draws the lymph into that lymph capillary. You also saw this illustrated when we talked about capillary exchange, and we said that the tissue interstitial fluid had a negative pressure, meaning that it acted not unlike a vacuum. And now we see why that is. That vacuum is sucking lymph into this lymph capillary. Now there are instances when these lymph capillaries can get clogged. They can be compressed by, let's say, a cast on a limb that's too tight. There could be a tumor pressing on these vessels, or as we're going to see in some pictures shortly, there can be occasions where a parasite can enter into those lymph capillaries and actually block them. The picture we're seeing here is elephantiasis as a result of this parasite. So lymph that would normally be drained from these lower limbs is now blocked. That fluid that came from the capillaries accumulates, and we see this very immense swelling. I think as many of you maybe do, particularly when you receive biology books for the first time, you thumb through them and you look at the pictures. And when I was a student in college, I did exactly the same. What we found is when I was looking through my parasitology book, and I can still recall it was during an English class, I was just thumbing through it, and the picture that I saw was this one here. And at first glance, I said to myself, why am I seeing a picture of a man sitting on a rock? And then in reading the description a little bit more closely, you'll note that that obviously is not a boulder, but rather his scrotum. So lymph here is being blocked, and the fluid actually built up below. Okay, obviously for this man to even be mobile and get around, what was told was he had to walk around with that scrotum in a wheelbarrow before him. This became particularly disconcerting to our soldiers who during World War II were obviously very, very concerned in that they were going to the Pacific where this disease existed. It was then told to them, though, that it required years of being exposed to contaminated water to have a situation where it got quite this severe. Our next discussion is going to deal more with the larger lymph vessels and ducts. Okay, here we're looking at both a diagram of the thoracic cavity, but also the body as a whole. One of the things that we're going to find, and we're going to emphasize a little bit more as we go, is what is the reason for having this lymph system? Logic would have told me that if we have fluid leaving the capillary at the arterial end, being returned back at the venous end, why not have it balance out right there? Why have that 15% remaining in the tissue space? What we're going to see is that this is going to be a very important aspect of that immune system. Now, looking at the diagram we see here on the right, we see that all of the fluid that comes from the right arm, chest, shoulder, and right side of the head, that is drained by a duct that's referred to as the right lymphatic duct. And that's what we're seeing here. So lymph is coming from the head, the arms, and from that chest region through this right lymphatic duct. All of the remainder of the body is drained, and that's what we see here by this sort of beige area. So both limbs, all of the abdomen, left side of the chest, left arm, left side of the head, that's now drained by the thoracic duct. Okay. Now, from the lower limbs, as that lymph is being drained through lymph vessels towards the thoracic duct, there's this enlarged area here, the cisterna chyli, that then collects that lymph. In either case, on the right or left sides, the lymph is ultimately returned back to the bloodstream. So if we think about it, the fluid that's pushed out of the arterial end, that's 100%. 85% of it returns back to the blood at the venous end. That remaining 15% is picked up by the lymph, and then it's ultimately returned back here to the blood. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, the question would be why. We're going to see that this plays a very important role in that immune system. Now, when we're talking about the lymph system, there are two major categories of organs and tissues. These categories are the primary lymph tissues, and what do we mean by these primary lymph tissues? This is the place where T and B cells divide, develop, and mature. So when we're talking about dividing, developing, maturing, they're multiplying in number, obviously via mitosis. They develop and mature, and by that we mean they become active cells and participate in the actions that they will do. You may recall that T cells were very, very important when we were talking about that cell-mediated immunity, and B cells were important when we were talking about humoral immunity, but obviously more about that in our next chapter. Examples of primary lymph organs are red bone marrow and the thymus gland. We then have secondary lymph tissues. These play no role in lymph formation, so that the lymphocytes are actually formed in the primary tissues. But these now are the site of the immune responses. An analogy you're going to hear me use a lot when we're talking about the immune system is I view it as our military system, that it has several branches, all designed to protect us. When I think of then what maybe the primary tissues are, is these would be the training centers. This might be boot camp. This could be a military academy where individuals go to actually learn to be soldiers and participate in protecting us in various ways. When I think of the secondary lymph organs and tissues, I think of these much more as the battlefield. These are the sites where the wars actually take place, and this would now be our secondary immune responses, and this is where the battles and we protect ourselves directly occur. Sort of fashion, we're going to talk about in the upcoming slides each of these in a little bit more detail, but this is just a nice quick summary to sort of refresh your memory as to the topics that we'll be talking about. The first of the primary lymphatic structures that we're going to talk about is the red bone marrow. You may recall that red bone marrow is found within spongy bone, and this spongy bone then is found within the flat bones of the skull, vertebrae, ribs, sternum, os coxae, and the proximal epiphysis of the humerus and femur. Here you'll see the proximal epiphysis of the femur, and this is where we find that red bone marrow. Now, we know that hemopoiesis takes place within red bone marrow. So therefore, all of the formed elements are produced here. So we see that things like red blood cells leave that red bone marrow, go into the blood. Then virtually all of the granulocytes, monocytes, and B lymphocytes. Okay, so those lymphocytes that we think of as B cells, they're both produced within the red bone marrow, and as we're going to see a little bit later on, this is where they also mature. So that what we have are B cells being produced in the red bone marrow, maturing within the red bone marrow, and then entering into the blood, where we then find those. We're going to see that that's a slightly different situation when we talk about those T cells, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. But the T cells, like all formed elements, are produced in the red bone marrow, but they are then going to go to the thymus gland, where that then brings us to that structure that we think of as the thymus gland. Some of you might recall when we talked about this a little bit previously, it's found in this area of the body that's referred to as the mediastinum. It's enlarged, particularly when we're young, a little bit more on that in a bit, and it's a bilobed gland, looking not unlike when we think of, let's say, the thyroid gland, which was up in here. So we see these right and left lobes to that thymus gland. It's particularly large in infants. It grows throughout puberty, and then it regresses in size. So if we're looking at a young child here, and then we look at the size of this thymus gland, it's then smaller in the adult. Just an interesting aside with this, sometimes you'll hear of people eating a type of food that's referred to as sweetbreads. And technically, sweetbreads are nothing more than this thymus gland. So it would have to be removed from a young animal, like a calf, as opposed to a cow. Okay, the significance of this we're going to see is that the thymus gland we saw is a place where those T cells develop. So most of our development of those T cells takes place during our childhood years. This is the time where typically we're exposed to many of the diseases that we'll experience throughout the rest of our lives. Okay. Each lobe of this thymus gland is made up of a cortex and a medulla, each with epithelial cells. So looking down here, we can see the medulla is this area in here, and the cortex is this outer edge that's out here. Okay, the cortex contains immature T cells. So if you recall, the thymus gland was the place where those beginning T cells leave the bone marrow and go to learn how to be functioning T cells. So you can think of this as almost being like college. The medulla possesses mature T cells. So as they go through their maturation process, they go from cortex to medulla. Okay, epithelial cells produce hormones that participate in this maturation of T cells. The major hormone that's produced here is called thymosin. And this is why we also discussed, just very briefly, the thymus gland when we talked about endocrine glands. That was one of the structures that we sort of skipped over that I said we would talk more about later. We next turn our attention to the secondary lymph structures. The first of which we're going to talk about are those that are referred to as lymph nodes. Now, as looking at these lymph nodes, there's a few things that we can see that aid us in understanding their anatomy and also their functioning. When we look at this lymph node, we see that it has this very, very distinct kidney bean shape. And this area where we see this indentation here is referred to as either a hilus or a hilum. Okay, now what we can see with respect to this bean is there are a number of tubes coming into this lymph node, and therefore we call these afferent lymph vessels because some of you may recall when we talked about the nervous system that adjective afferent meant towards. So an afferent nerve fiber carried information towards the central nervous system. Afferent lymph vessels carry lymph towards a lymph node. We then see a reduced number. In this case, we see one efferent lymph vessel. And this now is a vessel that drains that lymph node. If we were to look carefully inside of that lymph node, you may recall when we talked about tissues, we said that lymph nodes are comprised of reticular connective tissue. And this connective tissue then is made up of very, very fine collagen fibers. And those collagen fibers formed a network that cells could attach to. And at the time, I've emphasized that the cells that attach to these now are T and B cells. And as we're going to see in upcoming discussions, that these are the cells that are very instrumental in the workings of the immune system. Now, because we have many afferent vessels carrying lymph in, only one lymph vessel carrying lymph out, and within here this network of very fine fibers, as lymph is flowing through this lymph node, it gets slowed. And as it gets slowed, it allows for time for that fluid to be inspected by those cells, the T cells, the B cells, and also to some degree macrophages. What they are now doing is looking to see if there is anything abnormal or atypical within that lymph. So previously we posed the question, why have this system at all? Why not just have the fluid that leaves capillaries go back into the capillaries and bypass this lymph system altogether? We now have the opportunity that if anything foreign has been introduced into the body, it goes into that lymph, and now the lymph inspects it, and then we're going to see later that it's the job of the immune system to attempt to rid the body of that invading substance or thing. Now, when we look more at the internal structure at a lymph node, we can see that it's made up of a cortex and a medulla. The cortex is made up of what we think of as lymph nodules. So each of these structures here is what we think of as a lymph nodule. They contain those reticular fibers that we talked about. The center is called the germinal center, so we can see here this lighter area within the lymph nodule, and there we find proliferating B lymphocytes and some macrophages. Now that word proliferating simply means multiplying and dividing. We then see a mantle, and by a mantle we mean a coating of T lymphocytes. So we can see now that these lymph nodules are made up of both B, T cells, and macrophages. All of those cells, as we're going to talk about, which are important in the immune response. The medulla has strands of connective tissue, so now we can see that this area in here is the medulla. And there, once again, we find B cells, T cells, and also macrophages attached to it. So once again, we now can begin to see that if lymph is passing through in this direction, it is now inspected by these B, T cells, and also macrophages. Okay. Within cavities of this lymph node, called sinuses, we then see the presence of macrophages. And hopefully you recall when we talked about macrophages, what were they from? They were derived from those cells that we called monocytes, and we also see that they have the ability to phagocytize. Again, this will be very important in the body's defenses. Okay, the next of the secondary lymph structures, we see the presence of a structure called the spleen. The spleen is the largest lymphatic organ. It's located, as we pointed out before, in the upper left quadrant. It has a very, very rich blood supply. There is no cortex and medulla. Okay, so different now from a lymph node, but we'll see that there are some similarities. And we see the presence of trabeculae that divide the spleen into what we call white and red pulp. The white pulp consists of clusters of B and T cells, also with macrophages surrounding a central artery. So here again now we see a similarity between a lymph node. There are B cells, T cells, and macrophages, but note now that it surrounds an artery which contains blood, not lymph. The red pulp contains red blood cells, platelets, macrophages, and B lymphocytes. So if you recall now, this spleen has a double-edged sword sort of function. We know that one of the jobs of the spleen is to remove these red blood cells and platelets as they begin to age and become non-functional. But now we can also see that it plays a role in the immune system, in aiding in our body's defenses. So what are the functions then of the spleen? It now filters blood, and you can see it's quotes in filters. It's not so much a physical filtering, but rather a biological filtering. When we think of filtering, we remove particles that are small. In this case, what I'm envisioning as filtering is removing things that are potentially harmful to the body. We also see that it helps remove these old and defective red blood cells and platelets, but it serves as a reservoir for platelets. So we can save them there so that in cases when hemorrhage occurs, the spleen then releases these platelets to aid in the process of blood clotting. The next secondary structure we'll look at are the tonsils. These are lymph structures not surrounded by a fibrous capsule. So when we think of the tonsils, we think of a condition called tonsillitis. Recall once again that itis means inflammation of. And if we notice, we'll see that these tonsils are located. We have what's called a pharyngeal tonsil, a palatine tonsil, and a lingual tonsil. Looking at the location of these tonsils, they're in areas that are exposed to air being drawn into the body. So if we breathe in via our nose, it comes in contact with this pharyngeal tonsil. If we breathe in via our mouth, it comes in contact with the palatine and the lingual tonsils. So as we can well now envision that if there are any foreign invaders like bacteria and viruses that are drawn into the body in this fashion, they come in contact with these tonsils. We then see that these tonsils have an anatomy that's very similar to a lymph node. We see here a germinal center where we're going to find our B cells, T cells, macrophages, and they aid the body in fighting off that foreign invader. When we do get exposed to these, though, we then get what we think of as tonsillitis, which is an inflammation of these tonsils, okay, as the body is attempting to fight off that invader. Okay, the last of the structures that we're going to talk about are lymphatic nodules and something that's referred to as MALT. Lymphatic nodules are sometimes also called lymphatic follicles. Okay, on this slide, we simply see a comparison now of the lymph structures that assist the cardiovascular system. So now we're talking about returning materials to the blood after they've been inspected or with capillary exchange, and then lymphatic structures that assist the immune system, the body's defenses, and fighting off diseases and potential invaders. Okay, this then concludes the lecture on the lymph system itself. As you can see, it's relatively short, very, very descriptive, but it's going to lead us into